All right, let's dive into something everyone should have a handle on, no matter what first aid.
Absolutely. It's one of those things you never really think about.
Until you need it, right?
Exactly.
And you sent us a ton of info on first aid procedures. Looks like someone's prepping for something exciting.
Sounds like it.
So we're going to make sure you've got the essentials down so you can tackle any situation that pops up.
That's the plan. Because those few actions you take before help arrives can make all the difference.
Now, I'll be honest, I'm the first one Googling sprained ankle versus broken ankle after, well, a particularly energetic game of fetch with my dog.
Happens to the best of us.
So let's start with the very basics. How do we know if we're looking at a sprain, a strain, or a full-on fracture?
It's kind of like, trying to figure out if you've got a loose thread or like a real tear in your favorite shirt. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Sprains and strains, those are all about your muscles and tendons, those tough fibers connecting muscle to bone.
Right.
Fractures, though, that means we're dealing with an actual break in the bone itself.
Okay.
Now, all three can involve some pain, maybe some swelling, difficulty moving, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But here's the big difference. Fractures, they can actually look deformed, be super tender to the touch,
Oh, yeah.
or even make, like, a cracking sound.
Okay, that cracking sound, not good.
Not good.
So if there's ever any doubt, it's best to treat it as a fracture, right? Just to be on the safe side.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You wouldn't want to, like, shake a crumbling pillar that's holding up a bridge, would you? Same idea here. Immobilizing a potential fracture is key
Makes sense.
because it stops that injury from getting worse, and it helps with the pain, too. You're essentially creating, like, this support structure to hold everything together until the pros can take over.
Oh, I like that analogy. That makes a lot of sense. So let's say we do think it's a fracture. What are the immediate things we should do, according to this guide you've shared?
First things first, keep the person still.
Of course.
Moving a fractured limb, that's just asking for trouble. Unless there's some immediate danger, something else is going on. Keeping them immobile is priority number one.
Okay.
And then gently support the injured area. Like, imagine their body's built-in brace for a bit.
Got it. Don't try to be a hero and put bones back in place or anything. Right?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Leave that to the experts.
So support, check. What about bandaging? Is that always necessary?
This is where it gets a little interesting.
Okay.
This guide talks about immobilizing the injury by, like, bandaging it to an uninjured part of the body if you can. Like,
Yeah.
you might secure an arm to the torso or maybe one leg to the other, just creating some stability using whatever's available. But if you need to get to safety quickly, focus on just keeping them still.
So don't feel pressured to channel your inner wilderness survival expert and fashion a splint out of twigs if it's not absolutely necessary.
Exactly. Prioritize keeping things stable. That's the key takeaway here.
Makes sense. What else should we keep in mind in those first few minutes after a potential fracture? Any other tips or tricks?
Here are a couple of things people often forget. Don't give them anything to eat or drink. Yeah, they might need anesthesia later on, and an empty stomach is much safer. Trust me, I've seen it firsthand.
Oh, wow.
And if you've put a bandage on, keep an eye on those fingers or toes. They should still have good color and be able to move a little bit.
Right.
If they start looking pale or feeling numb, you might need to loosen that bandage a bit.
Wow, those are some really important details. I never would have thought of that. It's amazing how much practical information is packed into this. Okay, so we've covered sprains, strains, fractures, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Let's move on to another injury that's pretty common, burns. This document covers a pretty wide range from those annoying little sunburns to much more serious burns. Where do we even start with burns?
It's not always about what caused the burn, but how bad it is.
Right.
A minor sunburn is a completely different beast than, say, a scald from boiling water, right? And this guide does a great job of highlighting a type of burn that often gets overlooked: heat stroke.
Heat stroke, right. That's not a fire, it's not a chemical, but it is a burn, and a really dangerous one at that. So you mentioned this document does a good job of explaining it. What are the telltale signs of heat stroke? How do we know if someone might have it?
Here's the thing about heat stroke. Someone experiencing it will have skin that feels very hot to the touch, but they won't be sweating.
Oh, wow.
It's like their body's internal cooling system has completely shut down. And it can get really bad really quickly. Confusion, dizziness, even losing consciousness. It's a serious medical emergency.
That's scary. So time is of the essence in that situation. What does the guide say about how to react if we think someone might have heat stroke?
Urgency is key here. First and foremost, call for help immediately. Then get them out of the heat as fast as possible. Shade, AC, anywhere cooler. is better.
Okay.
The guide emphasizes cooling them down as quickly as possible, and I mean quickly. We're talking cool water, fans, even damp sheets, anything to bring that body temperature down to 37.5 degrees Celsius as safely and quickly as you can.
So we're taking action to cool them down, not just getting them out of the sun and crossing our fingers.
Exactly. And there's something else that's often missed. Even when it seems like their temperature is back to normal, you can't let your guard down.
Really?
Oh yeah, heat stroke is sneaky. It can come back with a vengeance. Continuous monitoring is absolutely crucial.
Right, you've got to be on high alert constantly.
Absolutely, you really do. You don't want to think you're in the clear only for things to take a turn.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about heat stroke, which is its own specific type of burn.
Right.
What about other types of burns, the more common ones? Any universal do's and don'ts for those?
Well, thankfully, there's a common thread for most burns: cooling. Cool, running water is your absolute best friend in those first few moments after a burn. And I can't stress this enough. Skip the ointments, the butter, all those home remedies, and whatever you do, don't even think about messing with those blisters.
So cool water and absolutely nothing else. What about ice? Should we be putting ice on burns?
Another no. Ice can actually restrict blood flow and do more harm than good. And this guide is very clear: don't do anything that could potentially make the skin damage worse.
Makes sense. And why is that? What's the biggest risk if you start putting things on a burn or breaking those blisters?
Well, think about it. A burn is essentially an open wound.
Oh, right.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything you put on it, especially if it's not sterile, you're just inviting bacteria to the party.
Right. Infection. It's easy to forget that when you're dealing with a burn.
Exactly. And that actually reminds me of another point this guide makes: taking off any tight clothing or jewelry near the burn. It's all about protecting that skin and letting it breathe.
That's one of those things that's easy to forget in the moment. You're so focused on the burn itself, but then you've got a watch or a ring cutting off circulation as the area starts to swell.
Exactly. Now, the guide does make one really important exception. If something's actually stuck to the burn, don't try to pull it off.
Oh, yeah.
Leave that to the professionals. You don't want to risk doing even more damage.
So, to recap our burn first aid, cool it down with water, avoid anything that could lead to infection, and don't hesitate to get help if you need it. Speaking of help, when is it a call the doctor later type of situation, and when is it a full-blown 911 emergency?
That all comes down to how bad the burn is.
Okay.
If it's minor and you're unsure about treatment, it's always best to be safe and seek medical advice.
Right.
But if it's large, deep, or covering a sensitive area like face, hands, or feet,
Right.
call emergency services immediately, even while you're cooling the burn.
Okay, that's a good rule of thumb to follow. Better safe than sorry, especially with burns. Okay, let's move on to some slightly less common but equally important burns. Chemical and electrical burns. What makes these burns different, and what should we be watching out for?
Chemical burns, they're like ticking time bombs.
Oh, no.
They really are. They can have a delayed reaction, so they may not seem as bad as a heat burn at first glance, but trust me, they can be just as serious, if not more so.
That's a scary thought. So how do you even know if it's a chemical burn, especially if the reaction isn't immediate? What should we be looking out for?
This guide does a great job of breaking it down. First off, you might actually see residue from the chemical itself. That's always a clear sign.
Right.
And then there's the pain. Chemical burns, they often cause this intense burning pain that actually gets worse over time,
Oh, so it's not a pain that fades quickly. What happens as that delayed reaction kicks in?
where you might see the area swell, maybe change color. Blisters can form too, just like with a heat burn. And depending on what the chemical was, the damage can go way deeper than the surface. It's not like spilling a glass of water.
Right.
It's more like spilling something much more corrosive.
That makes you realize how important it is to know what you're dealing with. If someone has a chemical burn, does this guide tell us anything about what kind of first aid they need?
It does. It emphasizes how important it is to identify the chemical if you can.
Okay.
It even gives some examples like strong acids, the kind you might find in drain cleaner, and alkalis, which are often in oven cleaners. I once treated a patient who had spilled drain cleaner on their hand and made the mistake of trying to neutralize it with baking soda.
Oh, no. What happened?
Let's just say it caused a huge chemical reaction and made the burn 10 times worse. Knowing what the chemical is helps the first responders know exactly what they're dealing with and how to treat it effectively.
So it's not always as simple as just rinsing with water.
You got it.
Yeah.
Rinsing the area with cool running water is generally a good first step for most burns, but with chemical burns, you really need to be careful and follow the safety guidelines for that specific substance.
Okay.
Some chemicals can react violently with water, which is why knowing what you're dealing with is so important.
It's a good reminder to always err on the side of caution. Find that product label if you can. Okay, let's move on to another type of burn that can be really scary: electrical burns. What makes these burns different, and what red flags should we be looking out for?
Electrical burns are tricky because what you see on the surface doesn't always reflect the damage underneath. This guide mentions that you might see actual burn marks where the electricity entered and exited the body. But even if those marks look small, there could be serious damage going on beneath the skin.
That's a scary thought. What's the most important thing to remember when dealing with an electrical burn? I feel like I should know this one.
You got it. You've got to make sure that electricity is completely off before you even think about going near the victim.
Of course.
That means unplugging, hitting those breakers, whatever you need to do to make sure you're not putting yourself in danger.
It's so easy to forget that you can't help someone if you become a victim yourself. Safety first, always. So let's say the electricity is off and we can safely reach the person. What are the immediate concerns then?
Well, beyond the obvious burns themselves, this guide highlights the risk of shock, even if the burn looks minor. Electrical shock can mess with your heart rhythm and in some cases even stop it altogether. It's not something to take lightly.
That's terrifying. So even if they seem okay at first, we need to be ready for the possibility of shock setting in.
Exactly. Keep an eye on their breathing, whether they're conscious, and of course, call for professional medical help. Always.
It's a good reminder that with electrical burns, things can go downhill really fast, and being prepared for that is essential. We've covered so much already, from those everyday injuries to those knowing this could actually save a life situations. It's amazing how much practical information is in this first aid guide you've shared with us.
It's all about giving you the knowledge and skills to handle whatever life throws your way.
Exactly. Speaking of which, let's switch gears and talk about another common but often misunderstood emergency poisoning. This guide covers all sorts of substances. What's the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to poisoning?
It might seem obvious, but in the heat of the moment, it can be easy to forget those little details that can make a huge difference for the medical team.
Like what?
Like knowing what the person ingested, what was it, when did they take it, how much did they consume. Those are all crucial details.
It's true. When you're focused on helping them, those little details can slip your mind.
Exactly.
So let's break down the guide's recommendations for dealing with potential poisoning. What are the immediate steps we should take?
The guide breaks it down into clear, actionable steps.
Okay, great.
First, assess the situation. Is the person conscious? Are they breathing?
Okay.
Then, if you can, try to figure out what they ingested, what was it, when did they take it, how much.
So it's like we're putting on our detective hats.
Exactly. But do it calmly.
Yeah.
You don't want to add to the stress of the situation. And then this is key call for help immediately.
So even if we're not 100% sure it's a real poisoning, it's better to be safe than sorry and get those experts involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With poisoning, it's always better to err on the side of caution.
Now, I have to ask about something I think a lot of us have been taught incorrectly. What about making someone vomit? Is that ever a good idea in a poisoning situation?
This is where it gets interesting. This guide is very clear. Inducing vomiting is usually a bad idea. And I really can't stress that enough.
Really? I always thought that was the first thing you should do. Why is it usually wrong?
There are a few reasons. First, think about it. The vomit itself could cause more damage on the way back up, especially if it's something corrosive or abrasive. And believe it or not, making someone throw up can actually make certain poisonings worse.
Oh, wow.
Some substances are even more dangerous if they get into the lungs, which can happen when you vomit.
So even if it seems intuitive to try and get it out of their system as fast as possible, it's not always the safest way to go.
Exactly. Now, the guide does have one exception to this rule. If they vomit on their own, try to collect a sample of it if you can.
Okay.
That sample could give medical professionals really important information to figure out the best treatment.
It's like saving the container, even if it's empty. Every little bit of information helps.
Exactly. That bottle or container could be the key to quickly figuring out what the poison is, which in these situations can be crucial.
Okay, so when it comes to poisoning, we're talking about staying calm, gathering as much information as we can, and letting the professionals take over.
Precisely.
It's amazing how much of this advice is actually the opposite of what we might think to do.
It is. We often have these ideas about first aid, but it's so important to remember that what we think we know might actually do more harm than good. That's why having good resources, like the first aid guide you're sharing today, is so important.
This has been a real eye-opener. We've covered everything from everyday injuries to those knowing this could be life-saving situations.
Absolutely. It's a great starting point.
Exactly. But, and I think this is important to remember, this is more of a first aid crash course. There's no replacement for hands-on training from the pros.
You said it.
So to our listeners, if you're feeling ready to take your first aid skills to the next level, we highly recommend finding a certified first aid course in your area. It's an investment in your well-being and the well-being of those around you.
And what better gift can you give than the confidence and skills to handle emergencies? Knowledge is power, and in this case, it could be life-saving.
That's a great point to end on. Remember, being prepared for emergencies isn't about living in fear. It's about facing the unexpected with confidence. And you know what? I think this deep dive has given us all a pretty good head start.
Infection, exactly. It's easy to forget that a burn is basically an open wound. So anything you put on it, especially if it's not like sterile, you're basically rolling out the red carpet for bacteria.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not something you always think about in the moment. And speaking of things we don't always think about, this guide also talks about removing any tight clothing or jewelry near the burn.
Oh, that's such a good point, and so often overlooked.
Mm.
In those moments, it can be easy to focus solely on the burn itself.
Right, exactly.
But then, you've got a watch or a ring that's suddenly cutting off circulation as the area starts to swell.
Exactly. So important to remember that.
It really is. This guide does make one important exception, though. If something's actually stuck to the burn, don't try to pull it off. Just leave that to the pros.
Okay, yeah. Don't make things worse.
Exactly. Better safe than sorry.
Much better. So, to sum up our burn first aid, cool the burn with water, avoid anything that could increase the risk of infection, and don't be afraid to get help. Speaking of help, when is it a call the doctor later situation, and when is it a full-blown dial 911 emergency?
That's where knowing how bad the burn is really comes in handy.
Okay.
If it's minor and you're just not sure about the best way to treat it, it's always best to err on the side of caution and get medical advice.
Right.
But if we're talking about a large burn, something deep, or if it's on a sensitive area, face, hands, feet, then we're talking call those emergency services right away, even while you're cooling the burn.
That's a great rule of thumb. Better safe than sorry, right? Okay, let's move on to some less common, but just as important, burn types, chemical burns, and electrical burns. Why are these in their own category? What makes them so different from, say, a heat burn?
Chemical burns, those can be tricky. They're like ticking time bombs.
Yeah.
They really can be. See, they might have a delayed reaction,
Oh, wow.
so they might not seem as bad as a heat burn right away.
Okay.
But trust me, they can be every bit as serious, if not more so.
That is kind of terrifying. So how do we even know if we're dealing with a chemical burn, especially if there's that delayed reaction? What should we look for?
This guy does a really good job at laying it all out.
Okay, good.
First, you might actually be able to see some residue from the chemical itself. That's a pretty clear sign. And then there's the pain. Chemical burns, they often cause this really intense burning pain, and it often gets worse over time.
Oh, so it's not one of those things that fades away after a few minutes. What happens as that delayed reaction starts to set in?
Well, you might see the area start to swell, maybe change color. Blisters can develop just like with a regular heat burn. And depending on the chemical, the damage can go way deeper than what you see on the surface. It's not like spilling a glass of water, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's more like spilling something much more corrosive.
Definitely makes you realize how important it is to know exactly what you're dealing with. If someone has a chemical burn, does this guide give any advice on what to do for first aid?
It does. It stresses how crucial it is to identify what the chemical is if you possibly can.
Okay.
It even lists some common examples like strong acids, the kind you might find in, say, drain cleaner,
Right.
and alkalis. A lot of oven cleaners have those. I once treated a patient who had spilled drain cleaner on their hand,
Oh, no.
and they thought they were helping by trying to neutralize it with baking soda.
Oh, no. What happened?
It caused this massive chemical reaction, made the burn 10 times worse.
Oh, wow.
Knowing the chemical lets those first responders, the EMTs, know exactly what they're dealing with and how to treat it best.
So it's not always as easy as rinsing with water then?
You got it. Rinsing the area with cool running water is a good first step for a lot of burns, But with chemical burns, you really have to be careful to follow the safety instructions for that specific chemical.
Right.
Some chemicals can actually react very badly with water. That's why it's just so important to know what you've got.
Definitely a good reminder to always be cautious. Find that product label if you can. All right, let's move on to another type of burn that can be pretty scary: electrical burns. What makes them different, and what should we be on the lookout for?
Electrical burns are so tricky because the damage you see doesn't always tell the whole story. What's going on underneath might be a lot more serious. The guide mentions that you might actually see burn marks where the electricity entered and exited the body. But even if those marks seem really small, there could be major damage going on beneath the skin.
It's a scary thought, realizing that what you see might just be the tip of the iceberg. So, when dealing with a potential electrical burn, what's the most important thing to remember? I feel like I should know this one.
You've got it. Make absolutely sure the electricity is off before you even think about going near the victim. That means unplugging things, switching off those breakers, whatever it takes to make 100% sure you're not putting yourself in danger too.
It's one of those things that's so easy to forget in the moment, you can't help if you become a victim yourself. Safety first.
Always.
So let's say the electricity's off and you can safely reach them. What are the immediate things you need to be thinking about?
Well, beyond the obvious burns, this guide talks about the risk of shock, even if the burn looks pretty minor.
Oh, wow.
Electrical shock can really mess with your heart rhythm, and in severe cases, it can even cause it to stop.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, it's not something to mess around with.
Definitely not. So even if the person seems okay at first, we need to be ready for that possibility of shock setting in.
Exactly. Monitor their breathing, see if they're conscious, and of course, call for help.
Yeah.
You always want to call for help.
Always, always, always. It's a good reminder that with electrical burns, things can change very quickly, and being prepared for that is so important. Right, so we're monitoring for those things. Breathing, consciousness, it's a lot to remember.
It is, and it shows just how important these deep dives really are. It's all about refreshing that knowledge so you're ready to act if you need to.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been amazing, by the way. We've covered so much: sprains, strains, all kinds of burns, and now we're tackling poisoning, which can feel extra scary because there are just so many substances out there.
It can definitely feel overwhelming. That's why having a solid framework like what this guide lays out is so helpful. You can kind of fall back on those steps even if you're feeling flustered.
Totally. So before we wrap up, any final thoughts for our listeners? Maybe something they can take away and start implementing today, no matter their first aid knowledge.
You know, beyond taking a first aid course, which, again, I highly recommend, I'd say the biggest takeaway is don't be afraid to act.
That's a great point. So often we freeze up because we're afraid of doing the wrong thing.
Exactly. Even if you only remember a few key things from this deep dive, like cooling a burn with water or calling emergency services for a suspected fracture, taking action is always better than doing nothing.
So much better. And that's what these deep dives are all about, giving you the tools and knowledge to feel confident and prepared no matter what comes your way.
Exactly. Because knowing what to do can truly make all the difference.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
Until next time.
A huge thank you to our expert for sharing their expertise, and to you, our amazing listeners, for joining us on this journey of knowledge and preparedness. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there.